Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. With us now from Washington is Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, a constitutional lawyer, the son of Reagan Solicitor General Rex Lee, and a former clerk for Justice Alito. Senator Lee understands the inner workings of the Supreme Court like few others. He is out with a brand new ebook, Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care, a conservative critique of the Supreme Court's Obamacare ruling. And Senator Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
In the book, you argue against the Supreme Court's ruling and the Obamacare legislation. You say Chief Justice Roberts rewrote and wrongly preserved. Did Roberts actually rewrite Obamacare in order to save it?
Absolutely, he did. He did it twice. First, when he took language that clearly imposed a penalty as a means of enforcing the individual mandate, and he rewrote that as a tax. Second, when he took the Medicaid expansion provisions, acknowledged that they were unconstitutional as written, and then rewrote them, making them constitutional by giving the states an opt-out provision, a provision that Congress did not provide for. So he wrote it not just once, but twice in order to save it from an otherwise inevitable finding of unconstitutionality. That's a problem, and that's why I wrote John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care.
So what happened to Roberts? You note that during the Chief Justice's first 7 terms on the Supreme Court that he distinguished himself as a fair-minded jurist and true constitutional scholar. Why did he uphold the law, and do you expect him to continue being a maverick on the court?
Well, first of all, I want to make clear, as I make clear in the book, that no one can know exactly what he was thinking other than him. And Supreme Court justices generally don't speak beyond the 4 corners of their opinions. So all we can do is engage in some speculation and figure out what some of the possible reasons might have been. I point out in Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care that he might have been influenced by those who said that he should be looking out for the institutional interests of the Supreme Court as an even-handed, non-political institution, that he ought to just defer to Congress when Congress duly enacts a piece of legislation, as it did with Obamacare, that he wanted to appear unbiased and not influenced by the fact that he was appointed by a Republican. And for reasons I point out in the book, none of those are really good reasons for shifting what might otherwise have been his analysis, what appears to have been his analysis at the oral argument at the Supreme Court, and what, according to many reporters, was in fact his position until a few weeks before the decision was announced by the court. In other words, Supreme Court jurists are expected to make their own opinions to decide cases based on what the law requires and not based on the public's perception of the court or of the individual jurist.
You note that Congress expanded the role of the federal government by enacting the ACA, and that the Supreme Court extended that role even further in order to uphold what Congress had passed. Short of full repeal, where do we go from here, and what can you tell us about Senate Bill 560?
For reasons that I explain in Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care, Senate Bill 560 would undo exactly what John Roberts did as the Chief Justice when he rewrote the Obamacare enforcement provision as a tax, in that it would say that nothing in that provision, the individual mandate provision, shall be construed as a tax or as a valid exercise of Congress's power to tax under the Constitution. If Congress were to enact that into law and thus make it consistent with what Congress thought it was doing at the outset, make it consistent with what the president and many Democratic members of Congress have continued to say since then, which is that it's not a tax, it's a penalty, then it would pull out these rewritten provisions that Chief Justice Roberts inserted into Obamacare itself. And the entire thing would collapse under its own weight.
So can you undo this legislation with your bill?
Yeah, we can undo the bad ruling by the Supreme Court with one piece of legislation. Now, this, of course, would be difficult in that it requires passage not only in the House of Representatives, where I think it could pass, but also in the Senate, which is controlled by the president's party, and that it would require us to submit that to the president, who could sign or veto it. And so, yeah, it's a tall order. But the point is, we need to be debating and discussing and voting on this legislation, because this does need to be put in front of the people's elected representatives. The bill, as it stands now, was rewritten by a branch of government that is not accountable to the voters. Once the justices are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, they're there for life, as long as they're not impeached and removed. And so there's no accountability there. So we now have an act that's on the books that is revolutionary and groundbreaking, and importantly, was not enacted by the people's elected representatives.
Well, the book is a fascinating read. And Senator, while we have you, I'd like to get your take on another story making headlines today. The Supreme Court ruled that Arizona cannot add to federal voter registration requirements by demanding additional proof of citizenship. How do you view this ruling?
Well, I respectfully disagree with the ruling. I had the opportunity to review it a few hours ago, along with Justice Kennedy's concurring opinion and with the two dissenting opinions filed by Justice Thomas and by Justice Alito. I agree with the dissenters in this case that the majority came to the wrong conclusion. The majority concluded that Congress did, in fact, preempt the state's ability to require some kind of proof of citizenship as a condition for their eligibility to vote. And that's a problem. It misreads the federal statute at issue, and it also ignores the sovereign right of the states, guaranteed by Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, to determine who may vote. And that's a big problem, and it's one that I think Congress needs to undo. This is one of those decisions that we can undo by statute, and I intend to make an attempt to do so.
The Supreme Court is expected to rule on the constitutionality of the Defense of Marriage Act. Could Roberts invoke the same principle of judicial deference to Congress and uphold DOMA?
Well, the court could, and I suspect may well, uphold the Defense of Marriage Act, but it wouldn't require the same extreme deference to Congress that he exhibited in the Obamacare case. Quite to the contrary, this would be something that he could do just applying ordinary judicial principles. It certainly wouldn't require extraordinary deference to Congress, the likes of which we saw in the Obamacare ruling.
Senator, President Obama recently announced 3 nominees to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which is considered the second most important court behind the Supreme Court. In your view, are these quality picks or liberal ideologues, and what kind of confrontation can we expect in the Senate over this?
Well, I'm not even getting to the merits of these nominees because of the fact that we've got a court in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit that is underworked. Its caseload per sitting active judge and its caseload per judicial panel is way down as compared to other circuits throughout the country. We've got some circuits where they're overworked and they don't have enough judges. We need to reallocate those judgeship positions. The Democrats in the Senate argued in 2006 when President Bush appointed a man named Peter Keisler to the D.C. Circuit, who, by the way, enjoyed broad bipartisan support for his nomination, that the D.C. Circuit's caseload didn't warrant filling this position, even though the judgeship vacancy did, in fact, exist. Now, 7 years later, we have confirmed already, just in the last few weeks, another nominee from this president to the D.C. Circuit, Sri Srinivasan. And even with that vacancy being filled, especially with that vacancy being filled, the D.C. Circuit's caseload per judge and per panel of judges is way down compared to basically every other circuit in the country. So I'm opposed to filling those vacancies, and I'm supporting legislation to reallocate the judgeships themselves to other parts of the country where they're needed.
To a completely separate story now, Senator. Today, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden came out insisting that he's not a traitor. You've been critical of the NSA's seizure of Americans' phone records. Snowden says the government can wiretap anyone. Number one, what should the U.S. do about Edward Snowden? And number two, does the government need to curtail its surveillance of Americans?
Well, look, as to the first point, as to what they should do with Eric Snowden, I'm sure there will be an investigation. And if the allegations prove to be correct, it sounds like he may well have violated some laws, and I suspect he'll be prosecuted. So I will leave that to the prosecutorial judgment of those who are assigned to do that. But as to where we ought to be looking to go as Americans, I think we do need to be concerned about the potential for abuse. I'm willing to acknowledge that the people currently working in the NSA are probably very well-intentioned people, very law-abiding individuals. And yet we know that the opportunity for abuse and manipulation does exist. So we've got to be very careful with what power we do give them. And there have been some disturbing reports suggesting that They have been listening to phone conversations of domestic phone calls without a warrant. And to the extent that this or things like it are happening, that's a problem, and we've got to rein that in and make sure it doesn't happen.
Senator, last question for you. You recently stated that you couldn't support the bipartisan immigration bill because of its comprehensive approach and said that it's nonsensical to argue that Congress has to address amnesty at the same time it deals with strengthening border security. Let's say the legislation passes out of the Senate. Should the House reject this legislation?
Yes, the House should reject the legislation because it's built on a series of false promises. We were told at the outset that this bill would make sure the border was secure before the legalization process commenced. It doesn't. We were told that this bill would assure that anyone put on the pathway to citizenship would be required to pay back taxes. The bill appears to do that, but when you read the fine print, you discover that it's an illusory requirement. It requires them to pay only those taxes that have already been assessed by the IRS, but the IRS will have had no occasion to assess the taxes of someone who's been working off the books, as illegal aliens typically are. The bill also allows for the legalization and eventual citizenship of a whole host of people who have previously been deported. And it doesn't require that we meet these border security thresholds that a lot of people are concerned about as a condition precedent for moving forward with the pathway to citizenship.
Should Republicans be concerned that this bill would lead to a permanent Democratic majority?
You know, that argument has been made, and I understand the argument. I think it's something that people ought to look at and look at very carefully. It's not the reason that I focus on because there are so many more glaring errors in the bill that I'm concerned about. But to those people who share that concern, perhaps that will be an additional reason for them to vote against it.
All right. Again, the book is Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare, a conservative critique of the Supreme Court's Obamacare ruling. It's available on Amazon.com. Senator Mike Lee, congratulations on the book, and thanks so much for being our guest today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.